The sun beat down on her back with the kind of intensity that made sweat bead along her spine before she had even turned over the first shovelful of earth. And Josephine Barrett wondered if she had made a terrible mistake trying to plant anything in this unforgiving Texas soil. Amarillo in the summer of 1882 was not a place for the faint of heart. The dusty streets kicked up grit that settled on everything, and the wind came howling across the plains like it had a personal vendetta against anything trying to take root. But Josephine had come too far to give up now. 3 months since she had buried her father. 2 months since she had decided to stay in this ramshackle cabin on the edge of town rather than return to St. Louis with her aunt. And 1 month since she had realized that if she wanted to eat anything other than hardtack and salted pork, she needed to grow her own food. The ground was hard as iron. Every thrust of the shovel sent jarring shocks up her arms, and her hands were already tender despite the gloves she wore. She had marked out a modest plot, maybe 20 feet by 15, behind the small wooden structure that now served as her home. The cabin itself was nothing special, just rough-hewn boards and a tin roof, but it was hers. Her father had won it in a card game, or so the lawyer had told her, along with a small sum of money that would not last forever. Josephine pushed a strand of dark brown hair from her face, leaving a smudge of dirt across her cheek. She was 22 years old, unmarried, and entirely alone in a town where women like her were as rare as rain. Most of the women in Amarillo were either married, working in the saloons, or passing through on their way to somewhere better. She did not fit into any of those categories, which made her a curiosity, and sometimes a target for unwanted attention. She drove the shovel into the earth again, putting her full weight behind it. The blade sank in perhaps 3 inches before hitting something solid. A rock, probably. She worked the shovel around, trying to pry it loose, her shoulders burning with the effort. That is not going to work. The voice came from behind her, low and steady, with the kind of certainty that made her stop what she was doing. She spun around, gripping the shovel like a weapon, her heart hammering against her ribs. A man stood at the corner of her cabin, tall and lean, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent under the sun. He wore dusty trousers, a faded blue shirt, and a hat that had seen better days. A bandana was tied around his neck, and a pair of worn leather gloves hung from his belt. His eyes were a startling shade of gray, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "I did not mean to startle you," he said, raising his hand slightly in a gesture of peace. "I was riding past and saw you working. Thought you might need some help." "I am managing just fine," Josephine said, though her trembling arms suggested otherwise. She did not lower the shovel. The man looked at the barely disturbed earth, then back at her, and she could see the doubt written plainly on his face. But to his credit, he did not say anything mocking. Instead, he nodded toward the plot. "That is caliche under there, limestone hardpan. You are going to break your back trying to dig through it with just a shovel. You need a pickaxe and you need to soak the ground first." Josephine felt her cheeks flush. She had not known about the caliche, had not known about much of anything when it came to gardening in Texas. In St. Louis, her family had employed a gardener who tended the flowers and vegetables. She had helped sometimes as a child, but that had been years ago, and the soil there had been soft and dark and forgiving. "I do not have a pickaxe," she admitted, lowering the shovel slightly. "I do," the man said. He gestured to a horse tied up near the road, a sturdy bay with saddlebags bulging with supplies. "And I have some time. If you would allow it, I could help you get this started properly." Josephine studied him, trying to assess whether this was genuine kindness or something else. Men in Amarillo did not usually offer help without expecting something in return. But there was something in his manner, a quiet steadiness that made her want to trust him. Or maybe she was just desperate enough to accept help from anyone. "Why would you do that?" she asked. He shrugged, a movement that seemed almost self-conscious. "Because it is the right thing to do. Because you look like you could use a hand. Because my mother raised me to help folks when I can." It was the mention of his mother that decided it for her. A man who spoke of his mother with that kind of simple respect was probably not going to cause trouble. "All right," Josephine said. "Thank you. I am Josephine Barrett." "Dalton Warner," he replied, touching the brim of his hat. Then he walked over to his horse and began untying the saddlebags. Josephine watched as he pulled out a pickaxe, its metal head scarred and pitted from use. He also retrieved a canteen and what looked like a length of canvas. He carried everything over to her plot, then knelt down in the dirt, running his hand over the ground she had been trying to work. "First thing," he said, looking up at her, "we need to water this. Not a lot, just enough to soften the caliche. Then we wait a bit, let it soak in. After that, I will break through the hard layer and you can follow behind with the shovel to clear out the loose dirt." "That seems like a lot of work for you," Josephine said, feeling awkward. "I did not mean to take up your whole afternoon." Dalton stood, brushing his hands on his trousers. "I have nowhere else to be. I was heading back to my place anyway, and that is only about 4 miles west of here. This is on the way." He said it so matter-of-factly that Josephine found herself believing him. She fetched the bucket she had been using to carry water from the well, and together they made several trips, pouring water over the marked-out plot until the ground was damp and dark. The water sank in quickly, disappearing into the parched earth like a man dying of thirst. While they waited for the ground to soften, Dalton leaned against the side of the cabin, and Josephine sat on the rickety porch steps. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. She had expected him to fill the air with questions or boasts, the way men often did. Instead, he simply watched the horizon, his expression thoughtful. "Have you lived in Amarillo long?" Josephine finally asked, more to break the silence than out of real curiosity. "About 5 years," Dalton said. "I came out here after the war. Worked as a ranch hand for a while, then bought some land of my own. I run cattle, a small herd. Nothing fancy, but it is enough." "The war," Josephine repeated. "You fought," he nodded, and something shifted in his eyes, a shadow passing over them. "I did." "Confederate Army. I was young and stupid, thought it was about honor, learned different soon enough." Josephine did not know what to say to that. The war had ended when she was a child, but its echoes still reverberated through the country. Her own family had been Union sympathizers, though they had been far enough north to avoid the worst of the fighting. She wondered if Dalton could tell if her accent or her manner gave away her northern roots. "I am sorry," she said finally. "That must have been difficult." "It was," Dalton said. "But it taught me what matters and what does not. Taught me that people are just people, no matter which side they are on. And it taught me that home is not a place, it is a feeling. I found that feeling here." He said it with such quiet conviction that Josephine felt something stir in her chest, a longing she had not realized she carried. She had not felt at home anywhere since her father died. The cabin was shelter, but it was not home. Amarillo was a place to survive, but it was not home. She wondered if she would ever find that feeling Dalton spoke of. After about 20 minutes, Dalton stood and tested the ground with his boot. Satisfied, he picked up the pickaxe and positioned himself at one end of the plot. "You might want to step back," he said. "This is going to send up some debris." Josephine moved to the porch and Dalton swung the pickaxe. The sound was like thunder, a sharp crack followed by the crunch of breaking stone. He worked with a steady rhythm, each swing precise and powerful. Chunks of caliche flew up, and beneath the hard layer, darker soil began to appear. Sweat soaked through his shirt, plastering it to his back. But he did not slow down. Josephine watched, mesmerized by the simple efficiency of his movements. There was something almost hypnotic about it, the way he worked without wasted effort, each swing exactly where it needed to be. She found herself noticing details she had not seen before. The breadth of his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened with each impact, the faint scar that ran along his left forearm. When he had broken through the caliche across the entire plot, he set the pickaxe aside and gestured for her to bring the shovel. Together, they began clearing out the broken stone and loose dirt, piling it at the edge of the plot. Josephine's hands ached, and her back screamed in protest, but she kept going. Dalton worked beside her, occasionally offering quiet advice about where to dig or how to lift without straining. The sun was sinking lower in the sky by the time they finished. The plot was cleared, the hard caliche layer removed, and the soil beneath was dark and workable. Josephine stood at the edge of it, breathing hard, her entire body trembling with exhaustion. But when she looked at what they had accomplished, she felt a surge of pride so intense it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "That is good soil," Dalton said, kneeling down to scoop up a handful. "It will grow whatever you plant in it as long as you keep it watered. What are you planning to put in?" "Tomatoes," Josephine said, "and beans, maybe some squash. I have seeds I brought from St. Louis." Dalton nodded. "Those will do well here if you can keep them irrigated. You have a well." "Yes, just over there." She pointed to the wooden structure near the front of the cabin. "Good. You will need to water every day once they start growing, maybe twice a day in the heat of summer. And you will want to put up some kind of shade cloth for the tomatoes, or the sun will scorch them." Josephine absorbed this information, filing it away. She had so much to learn, and the task ahead seemed suddenly overwhelming. But at least now she had a start. At least now the ground was ready. "I cannot thank you enough," she said, turning to Dalton. "Truly, I would still be trying to break through that caliche if you had not stopped." Dalton stood, brushing the dirt from his hands. "It was no trouble. I am glad I could help." He walked over to his horse and stowed the pickaxe back in his saddlebags. Josephine followed, suddenly reluctant to see him go. It had been so long since she had talked to anyone other than the shopkeeper or the occasional neighbor, and Dalton's presence had been surprisingly comforting. "Would you like some water before you go?" she asked. "Or coffee? It is the least I can offer after all you have done." Dalton paused, his hand on the saddle. Then he turned back to her, and for the first time since he had arrived, he smiled. It was a slow, crooked smile that softened the hard lines of his face and made him look years younger. "Coffee sounds good," he said. Josephine led him inside, suddenly self-conscious about the state of the cabin. It was clean but sparse, with almost no furniture and even less decoration. A narrow bed in one corner, a small table with two mismatched chairs, a wood stove, and some shelves holding her meager supplies. The floor was bare wood, worn smooth by years of use. If Dalton noticed the poverty of her surroundings, he did not comment on it. He simply removed his hat and took a seat at the table while Josephine busied herself with the coffee. She was grateful that she had splurged on real coffee beans at the general store last week. She ground them quickly and set the pot on the stove, adding water from the bucket she kept by the door. While the coffee brewed, she washed her hands and face in the basin, wincing as the water stung the blisters forming on her palms. When she glanced over, she saw Dalton watching her, his expression unreadable. "Your hands are going to hurt tomorrow," he said. "Do you have any salve?" Josephine shook her head. "I have some lard, that is all." "That will work," Dalton said. "Rub it on before you go to bed tonight. It will help." The coffee finished brewing and Josephine poured 2 cups, setting one in front of Dalton. He wrapped his hands around it, inhaling deeply, and Josephine saw some of the tension leave his shoulders. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, sipping their coffee. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending a plume of dust across the yard. The sun was almost down now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "You said you came here after your father died," Dalton said quietly. "Is there no other family?" Josephine hesitated, then decided there was no harm in telling him. "My aunt wanted me to come back to St. Louis with her. She has a large house and no children of her own. She said I could live with her, help manage the household, but I did not want that." "Why not?" "Because it would not have been my life," Josephine said. "It would have been hers. She is kind, but she is also very particular about how things should be done. And she had already started talking about introducing me to eligible men, suitable men, as if my purpose in life was to find a husband and produce grandchildren for her to dote on." Dalton's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "And that did not appeal to you?" "Not like that," Josephine said. "Not as if I were a broodmare being led to auction. My father always said I should marry for love, not convenience. He said he had married my mother for love, and even though they had only 10 years together before she died, they were the best years of his life. I want that, or I want nothing at all." She said it fiercely, surprising herself with the strength of her conviction. Dalton looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that she could not quite name. Respect, maybe, or understanding. "Your father sounds like he was a good man," Dalton said. "He was," Josephine said softly. "He was not perfect, but he was good. And he never lied to me, even when the truth was hard. When the doctors told him he was dying, he told me straight away, gave me time to prepare to say the things that needed saying. I am grateful for that." "What did he die of?" Dalton asked gently. "His heart," Josephine said. "It just gave out one night. The doctor said it could have happened any time. At least it was quick. At least he did not suffer." Dalton nodded, and they fell silent again. Josephine studied him over the rim of her coffee cup, wondering what he was thinking. His face was hard to read, all the emotions carefully controlled. But his eyes were kind, she thought. That counted for something. "What about you?" she asked. "Do you have family?" "My mother lives in Kansas," Dalton said. "She remarried after my father died to a good man. They run a boarding house together. I visit when I can, but it is not often. The cattle do not take care of themselves." "Brothers or sisters?" "A younger sister. She married a school teacher and moved to Colorado. I have not seen her in 2 years." There was a note of regret in his voice, quickly suppressed. "You ever get lonely?" Josephine asked, then immediately regretted it. It was too personal, too forward, but Dalton did not seem offended. He considered the question seriously, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Especially in the winter when the work slows down and the nights are long, but I have learned to be comfortable with my own company, and I have neighbors, other ranchers. We help each other out when needed." "That must be nice," Josephine said. "I have hardly spoken to anyone since I arrived. The women in town are polite, but they keep their distance. I think they do not know what to make of me." "Give them time," Dalton said. "Small towns are suspicious of newcomers. But once they see you are here to stay, once they see you are not causing trouble, they will warm up. It just takes patience." Josephine hoped he was right. The isolation was harder than she had expected. She had thought she wanted solitude, space to grieve and figure out who she was without her father. But there was a difference between chosen solitude and enforced loneliness. Dalton finished his coffee and stood, settling his hat back on his head. "I should get going. It will be dark soon, and I have a long ride ahead." Josephine stood as well, following him to the door. "Thank you again," she said, "for everything." "It was my pleasure," Dalton said. And then, as if the thought had just occurred to him, he added, "If you need any help getting those seeds planted, I could come back in a few days. Make sure you are doing it right." Josephine felt her heart lift. "I would like that," she said. "I would like that very much." Dalton nodded, and that slow smile appeared again. "Then I will see you soon, Miss Barrett." "Josephine," she said. "Please just call me Josephine." "Josephine," he repeated, as if trying out the shape of it. Then he touched the brim of his hat and walked out to his horse. Josephine stood in the doorway, watching as he mounted up and turned the horse toward the road. He raised a hand in farewell, and she waved back, standing there until he disappeared into the gathering dusk. That night, as she lay in bed with her hands throbbing and her muscles aching, Josephine thought about Dalton Warner. She thought about the way he had knelt in the dirt beside her, working without complaint. The way he had spoken about his mother and his sister with quiet affection. The way his eyes had softened when she talked about her father. She thought about the loneliness she had seen in him, a mirror of her own, and she wondered if perhaps she had found not just help with her garden, but something more, something that might, given time, grow into friendship. Or maybe, just maybe, something deeper. 3 days later, Dalton returned as promised. Josephine had spent the intervening time preparing the plot, adding the manure she had bought from a farmer on the outskirts of town and mixing it into the soil. Her hands were covered in fresh blisters, despite the lard she had faithfully applied each night, but she was determined to have everything ready. She saw him coming from a distance, riding across the flat expanse of land that stretched between the main road and her cabin. Her heart gave an unexpected flutter, and she quickly wiped her dirty hands on her apron, wishing she had thought to change into a cleaner dress. Dalton dismounted and tied his horse to the post she had set up near the well. He was carrying a burlap sack, which he held up as he approached. "I brought you something," he said. Josephine took the sack and opened it, finding a collection of small stakes and a ball of twine. "What is this for?" "Marking your rows," Dalton explained. "You want to keep your plants in straight lines with enough space between them for air circulation. The stakes and twine will help you do that. I also brought this." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded piece of canvas. "Shade cloth, like I mentioned. It is not much, but it should help protect the tomatoes once they start fruiting." Josephine felt a lump form in her throat. These were not expensive gifts, but they represented thought and care, and she was moved by his kindness. "You did not have to do this," she said. "I know," Dalton said, "but I wanted to. Now let me see those seeds you have." They spent the morning planting. Dalton showed her how to create furrows at the proper depth, how to space the seeds, how to cover them gently without packing the soil too tightly. He worked patiently, answering her questions without making her feel foolish for asking. When they finished, the plot was transformed, marked with neat rows of stakes and twine, the seeds tucked safely beneath the surface. "Now comes the hard part," Dalton said, straightening up and stretching his back. "Waiting and watering. It will be at least a week before you see any sprouts, maybe longer. You have to keep the soil moist but not waterlogged. Too much water and the seeds will rot. Too little and they will not germinate." "How will I know if I am doing it right?" Josephine asked. "You will not at first," Dalton said honestly. "Gardening is mostly trial and error. You do your best and you learn from your mistakes, but you have good instincts. I think you will figure it out." His confidence in her was heartening. Josephine looked at the garden, at the work they had done together, and felt a sense of accomplishment that was entirely new. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like she was building something, creating something that would last. "Will you stay for lunch?" she asked. I do not have much, but I can make us some biscuits and beans." Dalton hesitated, and for a moment Josephine thought he would decline. Then he nodded. "I would like that." They washed up at the well, the cold water a relief against their sun-warmed skin. Inside, Josephine set about preparing the meal while Dalton sat at the table, watching her with an expression that made her feel both self-conscious and strangely pleased. "You are good at this," he said as she mixed the biscuit dough. "At cooking," Josephine laughed. "Barely. My father and I lived simply, but I learned enough to get by." "That is more than a lot of people can say," Dalton said. "Out here, knowing how to cook and keep house can mean the difference between surviving and thriving." They talked while the biscuits baked and the beans warmed on the stove. Dalton told her about his ranch, about the challenges of raising cattle in Texas where the summers were brutal and the grass often scarce. He talked about the cattle drives he had been on when he was younger, the long months on the trail, the dangers from stampedes and rustlers and river crossings gone wrong. He talked about the satisfaction of building something with his own hands, of looking out over land that belonged to him, and knowing that whatever came next, he had created this. Josephine, in turn, told him about St. Louis, about the life she had left behind. She talked about her father, who had been a clerk in a law office, a man of modest means but generous spirit. She talked about the parks and the riverboats, the theaters and the churches. She talked about how different Amarillo was, how stark and unforgiving, but also how she was beginning to see a kind of beauty in it, a harsh honesty that appealed to something in her nature. The food was simple but filling, and they ate with the easy camaraderie of people who have worked hard together. After they finished, Dalton helped her wash the dishes, an act so domestic and unexpected that it made Josephine's chest feel tight. "I should go," Dalton said reluctantly as they dried the last plate. "I have fence line to check before dark." "Of course," Josephine said, though part of her wanted to ask him to stay longer. "Thank you for everything, for the help, for the supplies, for the company." Dalton looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "I enjoyed it," he said quietly, "more than I expected to." He left then, mounting his horse and riding off with a wave. Josephine watched him go, her hand raised in farewell, and when he disappeared from view, she found herself already looking forward to his next visit. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Dalton would ride over every few days, ostensibly to check on the garden, but really, Josephine suspected, because he enjoyed the company as much as she did. They would work together, pulling weeds, adjusting the shade cloth, discussing the progress of the plants. And then they would sit on the porch or at her small table, drinking coffee or water, talking about everything and nothing. Josephine learned that Dalton had fought in some of the war's bloodiest battles, that he carried scars both visible and hidden. She learned that he loved horses almost as much as he loved the land, that he could track a cow across miles of open range, that he had once killed a rattlesnake with nothing but a shovel and sheer determination. She learned that he was quieter than most men she had known, more thoughtful, but when he spoke, his words carried weight. Dalton, in turn, learned about Josephine's love of books, her frustration at having left most of her small collection behind in St. Louis. He learned that she had once dreamed of being a teacher, that she could recite poetry from memory, that she had a quick mind and a sharp wit, that she often hid beneath a veneer of politeness. He learned that she was braver than she gave herself credit for, that she faced the challenges of frontier life with a determination that impressed him deeply. The garden began to flourish. Tiny green shoots pushed through the soil, reaching toward the sun. Josephine tended them with a dedication that bordered on obsessive, watering them each morning and evening, checking for pests, adjusting the shade cloth as needed. Dalton brought her advice and sometimes more supplies: a bag of fertilizer, a hoe with a better edge, a pair of gloves that actually fit her hands. The people of Amarillo began to notice. It was impossible not to. Dalton's horse was often seen tied up outside Josephine's cabin, and in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, this did not go unremarked upon. The general store owner, a portly man named Henderson, made a pointed comment one day when Josephine was buying flour. "Seems like Dalton Warner has taken quite an interest in your property," he said, his tone implying something more than neighborly assistance. Josephine felt her cheeks flush, but she kept her voice steady. "Mr. Warner has been kind enough to help me establish a garden. I am grateful for his expertise." Henderson grunted, clearly not satisfied with this explanation, but he did not push further. Still, Josephine was aware of the eyes on her as she left the store, the whispers that followed in her wake. It made her angry, this assumption that a man and a woman could not simply be friends, that there had to be something scandalous about Dalton's visits. But it also made her wonder, was there something more developing between them? And if so, how did she feel about that? She thought about it that evening as she worked in the garden, gently loosening the soil around the tomato plants, which were now several inches tall. She thought about the way her heart lifted when she saw Dalton riding toward her cabin. The way she found herself watching the road on days when he did not come, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. The way his presence had become the bright spot in her otherwise solitary existence. Was this what falling in love felt like? This slow, steady building of affection and respect, punctuated by moments of sharp awareness, when his hand brushed hers or his eyes lingered on her face. It was different from the romantic novels she had read, where love was a sudden, overwhelming force. This was quieter, deeper, and it felt real in a way those stories never had. That night, as Josephine lay in bed, she allowed herself to imagine a future where Dalton was more than a friend, where he might court her properly, where they might build a life together. The images came easily, Dalton at her table every evening, not just occasionally. The cabin expanded, made into a real home. Children, maybe a family. A garden that grew larger each year, feeding not just her but them. It was a dangerous thing to let herself hope, but she could not seem to stop. Dalton was fighting his own internal battle. Every time he rode toward Josephine's cabin, he told himself it would be the last time. That he was getting too attached, that he was reading too much into their friendship. But then he would see her working in the garden, her face flushed with effort and determination, and all his resolutions would crumble. He had not expected to feel this way about anyone, least of all a woman who had arrived in Amarillo just months ago. After the war, he had convinced himself that he was better off alone, that he had seen too much, done too much, to deserve the kind of happiness that came with love and family. His nightmares were still frequent, dreams of battles and blood, of friends who had died in his arms. He did not want to burden anyone with that darkness, but Josephine made him think that maybe he could have more. She was kind without being weak, strong without being hard. She asked him about the war but did not press when he was reluctant to talk. She listened when he needed to speak and knew when silence was better than words. Being with her felt like coming home, like finding a place where he could lay down the weight he had been carrying for so long. One evening, about 6 weeks after they had first met, Dalton arrived at the cabin to find Josephine sitting on the porch steps, her face buried in her hands. He dismounted quickly, his heart clenching with concern. "Josephine, what is wrong?" She looked up, and he saw that she had been crying. Her eyes were red, her cheeks wet with tears. "It is the tomatoes," she said, her voice breaking. "Something is eating them. I went out this morning and found half the plants destroyed. I tried everything, I have been so careful, and now," she broke off, unable to continue. Dalton knelt beside her, his hand hovering over her shoulder before he gently let it rest there. "Show me," he said quietly. They walked to the garden together, and Dalton examined the damage. Several of the tomato plants had been stripped of their leaves, the stems broken, the small green tomatoes that had just begun to form lying on the ground, half-eaten. He crouched down, studying the tracks in the soft soil. "Rabbits," he said finally. "Maybe a ground squirrel or two." They got under the shade cloth. "How do I stop them?" Josephine asked, wiping her eyes. "I cannot lose the whole garden. I have worked so hard." "I know," Dalton said, standing, "and you are not going to lose it. We need to put up a fence, something low but solid, with mesh tight enough that they cannot squeeze through. I have some wire at my place. I can bring it over tomorrow and we will get it set up. But the plants that are already damaged, some of them will recover," Dalton said. "Plants are tougher than you think, and even if you lose a few, you still have plenty more. This is not the end, Josephine. It is just a setback." She looked at him, and some of the despair left her face. "You always know what to do," she said. "I feel so helpless sometimes, like I am playing at being a pioneer and failing miserably." "You are not failing," Dalton said firmly. He reached out and took her hand, his rough fingers closing around hers. "You are learning, and you are doing better than most would in your situation. You did not have to stay here. You could have taken the easy path and gone back to St. Louis. But you chose this, and you are making it work. That takes courage." Josephine looked down at their joined hands, and something shifted in her expression. When she looked back up at him, her eyes were bright with an emotion he could not quite name. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing in me, for helping me, for everything." Dalton felt his heart hammering in his chest. He was acutely aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth of her hand in his, of the way her lips were slightly parted as if she were about to say something more. He wanted to kiss her. The desire was so strong it nearly overwhelmed him, but he did not. Not yet. This was too important to rush. Instead, he squeezed her hand gently and then released it, stepping back. "I will be here first thing tomorrow with the wire," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "We will get this fixed." Josephine nodded, and if she was disappointed by his retreat, she did not show it. "I will have coffee ready," she said. The next day they worked together to build a low fence around the garden. It was hot, tedious work, pounding stakes into the ground and stretching the wire tight, fastening it securely so there were no gaps. By the time they finished, the sun was high overhead and they were both drenched in sweat, but the fence was solid and Josephine looked at it with satisfaction. "That should keep the rabbits out," she said. "It should," Dalton agreed. "And if it does not, we will think of something else." They went inside to cool off and Josephine poured them each a glass of water from the bucket. They drank deeply, the cold water a relief. Then Josephine turned to Dalton, her expression serious. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "Why do you keep coming back here? I mean, I am grateful, but surely you have better things to do with your time. Your ranch, your cattle, why spend so much time helping me?" Dalton set down his glass, considering his answer carefully. He could deflect, could make a joke or change the subject. But Josephine deserved honesty. "Because I like being here," he said finally. "Because when I am with you, I feel like myself again. Not the man who went to war, not the rancher who barely gets by, just me. And I have not felt that way in a long time." Josephine's eyes widened and he saw the color rise in her cheeks. "Oh," she said softly. "I do not want to overstep," Dalton continued, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "If my visits are unwelcome, if I am making you uncomfortable, tell me and I will stop. But if you feel even a fraction of what I feel when I am with you, then I would like to keep coming around, not just as a friend." The silence that followed was the longest of Dalton's life. He watched Josephine's face, trying to read her expression, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. Then Josephine smiled, a slow, radiant smile that transformed her entire face. "I feel it too," she said. "I was afraid to say anything, afraid I was imagining it. But I look forward to your visits more than anything else in my life. And when you are not here, I find myself thinking about you, wondering what you are doing, wishing you were here. So yes, Dalton Warner, please keep coming around." Relief and joy flooded through Dalton in equal measure. He closed the distance between them in 2 steps, taking her hands in his. "I want to court you properly," he said. "With your permission. I want to take you to church socials and town gatherings. I want people to know that you are spoken for, that I am serious about you." "I would like that," Josephine said, her smile widening. "Very much." And then, because he could not help himself, Dalton leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle, tentative, a question as much as a declaration. Josephine's lips were soft beneath his, and when she kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, Dalton felt something in him unlock, a door he had kept closed for years swinging open. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Dalton rested his forehead against hers, his hand still holding hers. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "So have I," Josephine whispered. They stood there for a long moment, simply holding each other, and Dalton felt a peace settle over him that he had not known was possible. This was right. This was what he had been searching for without even knowing it. Over the next several months, Dalton courted Josephine with a patience and dedication that made her heart swell. He took her to the church social, where she met more of the townspeople and was welcomed with surprising warmth. He brought her wildflowers that he picked on his rides across the range. He fixed things around her cabin without being asked, repairing the shutters that rattled in the wind, patching the roof where it leaked, building her a proper set of shelves for her few books. In return, Josephine cooked meals for him, hearty stews and biscuits, apple pies made from the dried fruit she had carefully rationed. She mended his shirts when they tore, her stitches small and neat. She listened to his stories and shared her own, and slowly, piece by piece, they built a life together even before they were officially united. The garden thrived. By midsummer, Josephine was harvesting tomatoes and beans, more than she could eat on her own. She shared them with neighbors, who repaid her with fresh milk and eggs, and suddenly she found herself part of the community in a way she had not been before. The women who had kept their distance began to stop by, ostensibly to see the garden but really to get to know her better. They brought advice and recipes, and Josephine discovered that she had been wrong about them. They had not been unfriendly, just cautious, waiting to see if she would last. Dalton's ranch also prospered. He had a good year with the cattle, and he used some of the proceeds to buy more land, expanding his holdings. He talked to Josephine about his plans, about the future he was building, and she understood that he was really talking about their future, the life they would share. In October, when the first cool breezes began to blow across the plains, Dalton asked Josephine to marry him. He did it simply, without grand gestures or elaborate speeches. They were sitting on her porch watching the sunset, and he took her hand and said, "I love you, Josephine. Will you marry me?" Josephine did not hesitate. "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I will." They were married in November in the small church in Amarillo with half the town in attendance. Josephine wore a simple dress of pale blue that she had sewn herself, and Dalton wore his best suit, brushed clean of dust. The ceremony was short but heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Dalton kissed her with a tenderness that made several of the women in the congregation dab at their eyes. The reception was held in the church hall, with food and music and dancing. Josephine, who had felt so alone just months earlier, was surrounded by people who had become friends, who celebrated with genuine joy. And Dalton, who had spent so many years keeping people at arm's length, found himself laughing and talking, the darkness that had haunted him lifted by the light of this new beginning. They spent their first night as husband and wife in Josephine's cabin, which would soon become their cabin. Dalton had already begun making plans to expand it, to turn it into a proper home. But that night, none of that mattered. They lay together in the narrow bed, wrapped in each other's arms, whispering promises and dreams, and Josephine felt a happiness so complete it was almost frightening. "I never thought I would have this," Dalton murmured against her hair. "A wife, a home, a future. I thought I had used up all my luck just surviving the war." "We make our own luck," Josephine said, turning in his arms so she could see his face. "We chose each other. We chose this life. And we will build something beautiful together." "We already have," Dalton said and kissed her. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were droughts that tested their resources, winters that were brutal in their cold, summer heat that was relentless. There were times when the cattle got sick, when the garden failed despite their best efforts, when money was so tight that they had to make do with almost nothing. But they faced it all together, and that made all the difference. Dalton expanded the cabin, adding 2 more rooms and a real wooden floor. Josephine planted more gardens, not just vegetables but flowers, transforming the barren plot around their home into something beautiful. They bought chickens and a milk cow, and Dalton taught Josephine how to ride so she could accompany him on short trips around the ranch. In the spring of 1884, Josephine discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with a joy tempered by fear. Childbirth was dangerous, especially on the frontier, and they had both known women who had not survived it. But Josephine was strong and healthy, and she had the support of the women in town, who rallied around her with advice and offers of help. Their first child was born in December, a son with Dalton's gray eyes and Josephine's dark hair. They named him Thomas, after Josephine's father, and Dalton held him with a reverence that brought tears to Josephine's eyes. She watched her husband, this man who had been so hardened by war and loss, cradle their son with infinite gentleness, and she knew that Thomas would grow up surrounded by love. 2 years later, a daughter arrived, whom they named Clara after Dalton's mother. She was a spirited child, quick to laugh and fearless, and she wrapped both her parents around her tiny finger from the moment she was born. Dalton built her a wooden cradle that rocked smoothly, and Josephine sewed tiny dresses with careful stitches, and they marveled together at the miracle of this new life they had created. The children grew, and so did the ranch. Dalton hired a couple of hands to help with the cattle, and Josephine took on the task of managing the household accounts, her neat handwriting filling ledgers with income and expenses. They were not rich, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. Thomas was 8 and Clara was 6 when Josephine told Dalton she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was harder. She was older now, 32, and she felt every ache and pain more acutely. Dalton worried constantly, hovering over her, insisting she rest, doing more than his share of the household work. "I am not made of glass," Josephine protested one evening as Dalton gently but firmly guided her to a chair. "I know," Dalton said, "but I am not taking any chances. You and this baby are the most important things in my life." The baby, another son, arrived in the early hours of a spring morning. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Dalton, pacing outside the bedroom while the midwife attended to Josephine, thought he might lose his mind with fear. But Josephine was strong, stronger than anyone he had ever known, and when he finally heard the baby's cry, followed by the midwife's reassurance that both mother and child were well, he nearly collapsed with relief. They named the boy Daniel, and he completed their family. Dalton looked at his 3 children, at his wife who had given him everything he had ever wanted, and things he had not known to dream of, and he felt a gratitude so profound, it was almost painful. The years continued to pass. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books almost as much as his mother did. Clara was a whirlwind of energy, always climbing trees or racing across the fields on the pony Dalton had bought her. Daniel was the peacemaker, the one who could soothe his siblings' arguments with a smile and a well-timed joke. Josephine's garden expanded year after year until it was the envy of the county. She grew not just vegetables but herbs, flowers, even a small orchard of fruit trees that Dalton had planted for her 1 anniversary. The garden that had started as a desperate attempt at survival had become a symbol of their life together, a testament to what they could build when they worked side by side. Dalton's ranch prospered, becoming one of the most successful in the area. He was respected in Amarillo, known as a fair employer and an honest dealer. Men sought his advice on cattle and land, and he gave it freely, remembering how others had helped him when he was just starting out. But for all their success, the thing that mattered most was the love they shared. Dalton and Josephine never took each other for granted. Every evening, after the children were in bed, they would sit on the porch they had expanded over the years, holding hands and talking about their day. Every morning, Dalton kissed Josephine goodbye before heading out to work, and she watched him go with a smile that never dimmed. As the children grew older, they began to ask questions about how their parents had met. Josephine and Dalton would exchange glances, and then one of them would tell the story of the garden, of the day Dalton had stopped to help a woman struggling with hard Texas soil. "So you fell in love over a garden?" Clara asked once, her young face skeptical. "We fell in love because we were willing to kneel down and help each other," Josephine corrected gently. "The garden was just the beginning." When Thomas was 16, he announced his intention to become a lawyer, like his grandfather had worked with. Josephine's eyes filled with tears, and she hugged him tightly, proud beyond measure. Clara, at 14, declared she wanted to be a rancher like her father, and Dalton began teaching her the business in earnest, treating her as seriously as he would have a son. Daniel, at 12, was still figuring out his path, but he had a talent for drawing, and Josephine encouraged it, buying him pencils and paper whenever she could. The ranch continued to grow, and Dalton began to think about the future, about what would happen when he was gone. He drew up papers with a lawyer in town, ensuring that the land would be divided equally among his children, that Josephine would be taken care of for the rest of her life. It was morbid work, but necessary, and Josephine sat beside him as he signed the documents, her hand in his. "We have built something good here," Dalton said as they rode back from town that day. "Something that will last." "We have," Josephine agreed, "and I would not change a single moment of it, even the hard times, even the struggles. It all brought us here to this life, and I am grateful for every second." They celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary in the fall of 1903. Their children, now young adults, organized a party at the ranch, inviting neighbors and friends from all over the county. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, and as Dalton held Josephine in his arms, swaying to a waltz played by a local fiddler, He marveled at how far they had come from that day when he had first seen her struggling with her garden. "You remember?" he asked softly, his lips close to her ear. "Every moment," Josephine said. "From the first time you knelt down beside me to help to this very second. Every single moment." "I love you," Dalton said. "I have loved you from the beginning, and I will love you until the end." "And I love you," Josephine whispered. "Always." As they danced under the stars, surrounded by the life they had built and the love that had sustained them, both Dalton and Josephine knew that they had found what so many people searched for and never found. A love that was true and lasting, rooted as deeply as the garden that had first brought them together. The years continued their steady march forward. Thomas left for university in the East, fulfilling his dream of studying law. He wrote long letters home, describing his classes and his new friends, and Josephine saved every one of them in a box she kept under her bed. Clara married a neighboring rancher's son, a good man who respected her intelligence and her strength, and they built a house on a portion of the Warner land, close enough that Clara could still help her father with the cattle. Daniel discovered a talent for teaching, and after finishing his schooling, he returned to Amarillo to work at the local school, bringing education to the children of the town. Dalton and Josephine became grandparents, first to Clara's twin boys, then to Daniel's daughter, and finally to Thomas's son, when he returned from the East with a wife and a thriving law practice. They delighted in their grandchildren, spoiling them as grandparents do, teaching them to ride and plant and raid and dream. The ranch was passed down, bit by bit, as Dalton grew older and less able to handle the physical demands of ranching. But he remained sharp and engaged, offering advice and guidance to his children and grandchildren as they took over the work. Josephine's garden remained her domain, though she had help now from her daughters-in-law and granddaughters. She taught them what Dalton had taught her all those years ago: patience, persistence, and the understanding that growth takes time. In the spring of 1918, Dalton fell ill with pneumonia. It came on suddenly, a cold that worsened rapidly despite Josephine's best efforts and the doctor's treatments. For 2 weeks, she barely left his side, sitting beside his bed, holding his hand, talking to him even when he was too weak to respond. On a warm afternoon, with the windows open and the smell of Josephine's flowers drifting in on the breeze, Dalton opened his eyes and looked at his wife. "Josephine," he whispered, his voice thin and weak. "I am here," she said, leaning close so he could see her clearly. "I need you to know," Dalton said, each word an effort, "that every day with you has been a gift. Every single day. I would not trade one moment of our life together for anything in this world or the next." "I know," Josephine said, tears streaming down her face. "I know, my love, and I feel the same. You gave me everything: a home, a family, a purpose. You saw me when I was lost and alone, and you chose to help. And that changed everything." "The garden," Dalton said, and a faint smile touched his lips. "Best decision I ever made, stopping to help with that garden." "Mine too," Josephine whispered. "Mine too." Dalton squeezed her hand weakly, and then his eyes closed. He passed peacefully, slipping away so quietly that at first Josephine did not realize he was gone. When she did, the grief that overwhelmed her was like nothing she had ever experienced. But even through the pain, she felt gratitude. They had had 36 years together, years filled with love and laughter, challenges and triumphs. Not everyone was so blessed. The funeral was the largest Amarillo had ever seen. Dalton had touched many lives, and people came from all over the county to pay their respects. Josephine stood between her children, accepting condolences with grace, knowing that Dalton would have been embarrassed by all the fuss but also secretly pleased. After Dalton's death, Josephine continued to live at the ranch, cared for by her children and grandchildren. She tended her garden every day that her health allowed, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of planting and watering and harvesting. The garden was more than just a source of food now. It was a living memorial to the love she and Dalton had shared, to the life they had built together. She lived to see the end of the Great War, to see her grandchildren grow into adults, to meet her first great-grandchild, a girl with Dalton's gray eyes. And through it all, she carried Dalton's memory with her, a presence that never faded. Josephine passed away peacefully in her sleep on a spring morning in 1925, 43 years after she had first knelt in the Texas dirt, trying to plant a garden alone. Her children found her in her bed, a smile on her face, her hands folded over a faded photograph of Dalton taken on their wedding day. They buried her beside Dalton under a cottonwood tree on a hill overlooking the ranch. The graves were marked with simple headstones, and between them their grandchildren planted a garden, filled with tomatoes and beans and flowers, a reminder of where it all began. The ranch remained in the family, passed down through generations, along with the story of how it all started, with a woman planting a garden alone and a cowboy who knelt down and helped. It became a family legend, told and retold, the details polished by time but the essential truth unchanged. Love could grow anywhere, the story said, even in the hardest soil if you were willing to work for it. If you were willing to kneel down and help, to put in the time and care, to weather the droughts and the storms. And if you found someone who would kneel down beside you, who would work side by side with you through all the seasons of life, then you had found something precious and rare. The garden that Josephine and Dalton planted together, both literal and metaphorical, continued to flourish long after they were gone, nourished by the love they had shared and the legacy they had built. And in that, they had achieved a kind of immortality, not through fame or fortune, but through the simple, profound act of choosing each other day after day, year after year, until the very end. Their great-great-grandchildren still work the land, still tend gardens, still tell the story of the woman who planted alone and the cowboy who stopped to help. And in the telling, the love lives on, as constant and enduring as the Texas sun, as deep and nourishing as the soil that first brought them together. It was a love story written in earth and sweat, in shared meals and quiet evenings, in the laughter of children and the satisfaction of hard work. It was a love story that proved what Dalton and Josephine had always believed, that the best things in life are not found but built, one day at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one choice at a time. And it all began with a garden, with two people willing to kneel down in the dirt together and plant something that would grow.